Hello. Today we're going to talk about the issue of moral relativism. If you'll recall, moral relativism are those body of moral theories that do not believe that universal objective moral principles exist. And what that means in essence is that there's no such thing as a universal moral principle that exists outside of your mind. And so today we're going to look at two different views of moral relativism and their relative strengths and weaknesses. The first view, or the first version of moral relativism, is what might be known as subjective ethical relativism. Subjective ethical relativism. Now, this is often called, sometimes also called individual relativism. And basically, this view, subjective ethical relativism, holds that morals are simply a matter of personal opinion. That you have your beliefs about what's wrong and right, and I have my beliefs about what's wrong and right. And really, there are no moral authorities higher than our own personal opinion to which we can refer in order to tell whether something is good or bad, right or wrong. Morals are simply a matter of personal opinion. Now, David Hume was one of the thinkers that held to a view like this. David Hume was an empiricist philosopher during the time of the Enlightenment. But David Hume says that basically morals are just simply a matter of personal opinion, that what you say is good, really what you're saying when you say that something is good, is that it's something that you like. And when you call something bad, what you're really actually saying is that thing that you call bad is actually just something that you don't like. There's nothing else that we can appeal to in order to say whether it's actually good or actually bad. The only thing that you can say is that, well, I like this or I don't like that. And so morals are, again, a matter of personal opinion. And to illustrate this point, David Hume says basically, he says that incest is only wrong because people think that it's gross. And he brings up this example because he says, look, here's the deal. If there really are such things as objective moral principles that are universal in scope, then that would mean that they would apply to everything and everyone. That they, just like the law of gravity applies to everything and everyone. It doesn't matter if you're a person who's walking along the ground or if you're a bird flying in the air. The law of gravity, because it's universal, because it's objective, applies to everybody equally. He says, but look, here's the deal. When you look into the natural world outside of just human beings, there are virtually all other animals commit incest, and they do it without any sort of moral problems or moral issues. They don't think it's gross. They do what animals do because of their animal impulses, and so obviously the moral law, do not commit incest, doesn't apply to those animals. Because they don't apply to those animals, then it doesn't apply universally. Therefore, morality is not universal. That would be David Hume's argument, that incest is only wrong because people don't like it. The idea of incest probably does sound pretty abnormal or immoral to us. But think about a situation that happened I think it was about 9 or 10 years ago in the UK, where there was a man and a woman who came together. They began to date. They began to get to know each other a little bit better. They marveled at all of the similarities that they had in common. They both shared the same birthday. They both liked the same kinds of things. They both actually were adopted, and they shared that. Well, as it turns out, this couple fell in love. They got married. They had a child or two, if I'm not mistaken, and only to find out later on through some medical tests and things like that they were actually brother and sister that had been separated. They were twins that had been separated at birth, who had found one another and fallen in love and gotten married. Now, up until the point where they found out that they were brother or sister, they didn't have a moral problem. There was no moral issue with them. Their friends would not have thought them abnormal. They were legally married up until that point. And so what's the big deal about incest? That's what David Hume would say. It's just this opinion that we have that we don't like it. Well, the problem with Hume's argument, or the way in which he's arguing, is that it kind of begs the question. Let me explain. See, Hume is arguing that if morals are universal in scope, then they would apply to animals, and they would apply to other animals, maybe even insects, maybe even plants and things like this. Just like the law of gravity, because it's universal in scope, applies to all. But that doesn't stand to necessarily reason, because if morals are a matter of higher reasoning, then basically those morals would apply to those beings that are in existence that are capable of higher reasoning. We sort of intuitively know this, don't we? I mean, if a child, say a toddler of 4 or 5 years old, goes running, streaking naked through the front yard, we laugh at that, and we joke at that, and we may tell them to come back here and put some clothes on, we don't think of anything wrong necessarily with the child, because the child doesn't know any better. However, if a grown adult runs streaking naked through the front yard, then that's a problem. Why? Because we believe that adult human beings are capable of discerning what is proper and what is not. So something's obviously either wrong or very immoral with that person who does that. So just because the taboo against incest doesn't necessarily apply to animals, that doesn't mean that it's not actually a moral law. Moral laws apply to those beings capable of understanding them and grasping them. Moral laws, in essence, apply to what might be known as moral subjects, or moral agents, if you will. A moral agent is a being that is capable of acting in a moral way. Another problem with subjective ethical relativism is this. What if we were to take this view actually consistently? What if we were consistent with this view? What would being consistent with this view mean for the criminal justice system, for example? Every law has a moral basis. And if that's the case, even traffic laws would have a moral basis. And they do. I mean, traffic laws, the speeding laws, the speed limits, and stopping at red lights and things like this have a moral basis. They have a moral basis in the fact that we believe that human life is valuable, and in order for us to get along and in order for us to be able to operate motor vehicles in a safe manner that does not harm innocent human life, or that poses the least threat possible, we have to have a system of laws that are orderly. Well, all of those laws presuppose the value of human life, that human life is, that it is wrong to harm innocent people, and that it is wrong to bring harm even in an inadvertent way to human beings. And so every law that we have has a moral basis. Well, if that's the case, and if subjective ethical relativism is true, then what does that mean for the criminal justice system? Does that not mean that we would have no basis from which to formulate laws? That we would have it would simply be one person or one group of people who would be pushing their own opinions on someone else. If morals are a matter of personal opinion, and if laws are based on moral principles, then whose morals are we going to formulate laws on the basis of? The majority? Okay, well, if that's the case, then the majority gets to push their opinion on the minority, even if it's just 51% of the people. And so subjective relativism becomes a view that really would be quite hazardous to our justice system. This view also, if followed to its logical conclusion, results in what one might call moral nihilism. Moral nihilism is the view that there are no moral principles, that there's no morality. And so then what that would present, I believe, to people who had moral taboos is that would set up within their own mind and in their own life a system that would hinder their ability to flourish in a society where morals are non-existent. Think about what would happen for just a moment. If we followed this consistently, if I do what's right for me and if you do what in your opinion is right for you, then basically what that would lead us to is chaos. What would stop a person if they believed that it was morally right in their opinion, that it was okay to murder other human beings? What would stop them from doing that? And how would we formulate a law to stop them from doing that? Would we not just be pushing our opinion on someone else? And so subjective ethical relativism really is not a livable ethic. It's not one that people can follow consistently, because we all have values. And we believe that there are values that not only should we hold, but that should be held by others as well. So subjective ethical relativism is a very difficult one to see how one would live that consistently. All right, the next view of moral relativism that we'll look at is the view that's known as conventional ethical relativism. Conventional ethical relativism. Now, conventional ethical relativism also goes by the name of conventionalism. So if I say that, understand that that's a synonym. It's just a shortened version. Conventionalism. It also goes by the name, with some modifications, but basically the same as cultural relativism. Cultural relativism. So conventional ethical relativism, cultural relativism, conventionalism, those can be used at this point interchangeably, basically. And conventional ethical relativism basically says that there's no such thing as a universal moral objective ethic. However, in order for human beings to get along and flourish in society, there has to be an agreed upon system of behaviors and taboos and things like this that are existent within a particular culture. And so conventional ethical relativism basically says that your morals and my morals come from our culture, and that's the only morals that exist. So every culture has its own system of morals and morality, their system of ethics. And there's nothing more than that. So the United States, for example, has its system of morals and ethics. But if you were to go over to someplace like Saudi Arabia has their own system of morals and ethics. And if you were to go to somewhere like France has their system of morals and ethics. And each one of these cultures represents a sort of sealed off and holistic approach to ethics, such that there are some actions that are correct and proper and right in the United States that may be frowned upon in other contexts. So each culture has its own individual set of morality and set of moral principles, and there really is not a lot of communication between them. Morals come from individual cultures then, and that's where we get our morals. Now, Mary Midgley, who's a person who wrote on this topic, refers to this as moral isolationism. And she does so because this presents a scenario in which one system of morals in a particular culture is sort of sealed off from another one. Now, there can be communication and there can be influence between them, but when you step foot into that particular culture, what is good is determined by that culture and not the culture that you just came from. So if I were to go traveling and I were to go to France, for example, and there would be certain things that would be okay to do in France that maybe not necessarily okay to do in the United States. And vice versa. There may be some things that are okay and acceptable in the United States that would not be acceptable in France. And I think the further that you get away from your culture, the more distinct and the more definite those differences become. So if you were to go to, for example, if I remember I knew a couple at one point in my life who was very good friends with. The husband was a former missionary to Afghanistan. This is back before 9/11, I believe. It goes back a little ways. And anyway, his wife was a missionary in North Africa somewhere, and this is how they met. They met because they were both missionaries on the field, and but both of them at that time were ministering in a Muslim context. And I remember she was a Caucasian young lady who was ministering there. She still had to, when she went into that context, if she wanted to talk to the people that were there and communicate and do life and even go to the market or whatever the case may be, she had to adopt their system of morals as it relates to how women are to interact in society. For example, there were strict taboos on who she could talk to as it relates to males and other men. There are strict taboos on what she could wear and what had to be covered up. And so she had to adopt their cultural preferences when she went into that context because of this dynamic of cultural relativism and the isolation that she had, that culture had from her host culture, from her native culture, which was the United States. So there was an isolation between them, and they represent sort of a bubble. Each culture is sort of its own bubble, sealed off from others. There may be a little bit of communication between them, but the further you get away from your culture, the more you're going to realize how isolated they are from one another. Each society basically has its own standard of right and wrong, according to this view, and this is based on two different premises or theses, if you will, theses. The first thesis that the argument for conventional relativism is based off of is what is known as the diversity thesis. Now, the diversity thesis basically says that different cultures have different moral practices. And it would be very difficult for us to argue against this. I mean, it's self-evident. If you go to, for example, Afghanistan, this may have changed recently, but up until recently, if it did, up until recently, women, for example, were not allowed to drive a car. Whereas in the United States, that's no problem. Women can drive cars anybody can drive cars so long as they can pass the examination and as they qualify for a driver's license. So there are different moral practices. It's immoral in Afghanistan, and it's moral in the United States. Excuse me. Different cultures have different moral practices. Now, the book brings up an example of this, or an example where in the book Herodotus, who was an ancient Greek historian, he depicts a scene in the court of King Darius that he's recording for history's sake. And he's passing this along, and King Darius is sitting on his throne, and he's receiving all the tribute from the various nations that he rules over, for he's kind of an emperor. He's a Persian emperor. And one group of people come in, and they're Greek people. So they're Greek in their culture, they're Greek in their beliefs and all this. And he asks the Greeks, he says, hey, tell me, you guys, what do you do in your culture in order to honor the dead, or when someone dies? You've got to do something with the body. You've got to do something. What do you do in your culture? And the Greeks respond, and they say, well, what we do, King Darius, is that we will wash the body of the one who we loved, and we will lay him or her out on a funeral pyre. We will place 2 silver coins, one on each eye, and then we will burn the body of our loved one. That's the way that you would deal with one who is passed on, and especially if you wanted to honor them. And so anyway, they were talking about this, and all of a sudden there's another group of people in there waiting to pay tribute to King Darius. They were known as the Calations, and they were an Asian group that sort of passed off from existence since then. But the Calations were aghast at this. You burn the dead body? I can't believe that you do that. They were horrified by the idea of cremation. And so then the King Darius says to the Calations, well, what do you do when you want to when you have someone who has died? They say, "Oh, King Darius, we don't burn the body and thereby waste its vitality and its spirit. Rather what we do is we eat the body, we consume the body of the one who has died, and they have gone on." And of course, the Greeks are absolutely aghast at this suggestion that cannibalism is somehow acceptable. And so Darius is sitting there, and everybody's all disturbed. The Greeks are disturbed at the cannibalism of the Calations, and the Calations are disturbed at the cremation that the Greeks do. And Darius is just sitting on his throne, and he makes the comment, I guess culture is king. Different cultures have different moral practices, and that's the diversity thesis. And I think that we live in a world that is small enough in the sense that we can communicate across cultural barriers at the click of a mouse, right? Or at the tap of the screen on your phone. You can talk to someone in a completely different culture. We have access like never before in history, and we see that yes, different across the world, moral practices vary from culture to culture considerably. Well, that's premise one, the diversity thesis for cultural relativism or conventional ethical relativism. Premise number two is what is known as the dependency thesis. And the dependency thesis basically says this. It says whether an act is right or wrong depends upon the culture in which it takes place. Whether an act is right or wrong depends upon the culture in which it takes place. And so if you're going to ask a question like, is physician-assisted suicide moral? Well, that's not enough information. The one who believes in conventional relativism would say, well, in order to answer that question properly, I have to know where are you planning on doing this physician-assisted suicide? Because if you do this physician-assisted suicide in a state where it is not legal, then no, what you're doing is wrong, because the culture has determined that this is a wrong thing to do, that this is an immoral act. However, if you're doing this physician-assisted suicide in a state where where it is legal, where those laws have been passed, then what you're doing is completely moral, so long as you follow the guidelines set up for doing this. So whether an act is right or wrong depends upon the culture in which it takes place. So that's the dependency thesis, or premise two, of the argument in favor of cultural relativism or conventional ethical relativism. So is that true? Well, it is certainly true that if you go into a culture and you start doing things that were okay to do in your culture, but are no longer okay to do in the culture that you're going to, that you're going to run into problems for sure. For if you, for example, dress like you would in the United States, particularly for women, and you were to go over to a place that is governed by Sharia law, and you were to try to dress this in a similar fashion, that would be frowned upon considerably. In fact, in some places, depending upon how strictly they follow the Sharia law, you could be beaten in public for that. You could be tied to a post and beaten with canes in public for dressing immodestly. That's a possibility. So, in some places. So whether an act is right or wrong depends on where it takes place. It depends on the culture in which it takes place. Now that leads us to the conclusion. Those are the two premises. The first one is different cultures have different moral practices. The second one, the dependency thesis, is whether an act is right or wrong depends upon where it takes place or what culture it takes place. And the conclusion to that argument for the one who believes in conventional moral relativism is that there are no universal moral principles. We learned our principles from our cultures, and because that's all that we have to go on, there are no such thing as universal moral principles. So that's the argument. Now the question is this a sound argument? Is this argument both true and valid? Is this a sound argument? Well, there have been definitely some discussion on that. Let's examine the first thesis, the diversity thesis. The diversity thesis says that that different cultures have different moral practices, but do they really? Do different cultures actually have different moral practices? Well, according to a philosopher, he's a current philosopher named Louis Poman, he brings up the concept of what he calls core morality. And the idea of core morality is basically this. He says that the core morality is a set of moral principles that every culture has to realize if that culture is going to flourish. So these are moral principles that a culture must recognize if it's going to flourish. And to the extent that a culture does not recognize these moral principles, it will suffer. It will suffer. And he lists out several different values. So, for example, he talks about the value of human life. And if a culture doesn't recognize the value of human life to some degree, then that culture doesn't get off the ground. It doesn't flourish. It can't flourish. Because think about what life would be like if there was no cultural value of human flourishing. Of human life. That there's no cultural value of human life. Where would you be? Where would I be? We would be constantly looking over our shoulder, expecting to be attacked by someone because nobody around here values human life. And if that was the sum of our existence, think about how life would progress. It would not be very good indeed. We would be constantly paranoid. We'd be constantly looking over our shoulder. But in order to promote human flourishing, a culture has to recognize the value of human life. Another one would be the value of truth-telling. If you can think about the value of truth-telling, now it's absolutely the case that people in our culture lie. And it may even be the case, it can be argued anyway, that it is the case that lies are sometimes in different cultures, lies are justified. Certain kinds of lies, if you will, are justified. But understand this, that when you are in a culture and a particular lie is justified, a particular way of lying is justified, then your culture has a way of accounting for that so that when you communicate according to that lie, the person with whom you're communicating understands it to be untrue and proceeds with that understanding. So what that really means is even though you may have uttered a lie with your mouth, people in that culture recognize that the truth or the message that you're trying to communicate. For example, if your friend asks you, do you like this shirt that I'm wearing? And you say, yeah, that's a great shirt. Well, what have I just communicated? Well, through a sort of communication of sarcasm, I have communicated that, man, I think that shirt is ugly, right? So the message was communicated, and even though what I spoke was technically an untruth, nevertheless, the way in which I spoke it was intended to communicate truth, okay? So truth-telling is absolutely necessary for a culture to realize for a culture to value, in order for that culture to flourish. Now, why is that? Well, because here's the deal. If you were to go out on a given day and talk to any given person, if you were expecting, because our culture does not value truth-telling, if you were expecting that person with every other claim that they made, if you're expecting them to be telling a lie, how soon would it be before you would ignore them? I mean, think about it like this. Have you ever known somebody who's a habitual liar? What's it like talking to someone who's a habitual liar? Well, at first you feel offended because they lied to you and you discovered it and you feel hurt, especially if that person was close to you. After that, you don't trust them so much. It's sort of like the boy that cried wolf. And so you're like kind of standoffish to them. And so you don't trust them so much to tell the truth. In fact, you might sit back and just scrutinize everything that they say, trying to find the loophole, trying to find the lie. And eventually, if they continue in this lying, this habitual lying, so that half of what they say is true and half of what they say is lie, eventually you're just probably your relationship with them is going to devolve into the idea that I'm just going to listen to this person to see what they're going to try to pull over on me. And after I'm done listening, after I'm bored of this, I'm just going to dismiss them altogether. So human communication could not take place without the value of telling the truth. Now, if that's the case, think about all the things that would be absolutely impossible without the ability to communicate with other people. Like you couldn't write books. You wouldn't even listen to this video. I mean, you're listening to this video right now because you believe that what I'm telling you is at least what I believe to be true. So human flourishing will not proceed unless we have a value of telling the truth. People just won't talk to one another, and there could be no education, there could be no communication, there could be no contracts, there could be no reason to call people or text people or email people because half of what they're saying may be a lie. Who knows? If there's no value in culture of telling the truth, then culture doesn't get off the ground. Civilization is impossible. So we've looked at two: the value of human life, the value of truth-telling. What about the value of promise keeping? The value of promise keeping. We believe that keeping your promise is a good thing in our society and in our culture, and so we value the idea of keeping promises. Think about what life would be like if no one kept their promise. If they said they would do something and then they just didn't. Think about what life would be like then. You wouldn't be able to have families. You wouldn't be able to have, because marriage is based on a contract, right? And that's the core of a family. The idea of commitment between two people, that's the foundation for a family. You wouldn't be able to have a contract. How many of us bought our house or our car or any other expensive thing without signing a contract for a loan? You wouldn't be able to do that. You wouldn't be able to, investors would not be able to invest money because that's based on contracts. And if they couldn't trust in some way that the person that they're entering the agreement with would tell the truth, then those things would be impossible. So the very building that you're sitting in, the computer that you're listening to this on, none of those things are possible without the value of telling the truth. And so civilization as we know it is not possible. Now there are many other ones that Pohman mentions. These are three. I'll mention one more: the value of property. The value of property. If we didn't believe in the value of property, then there could be no accumulation of wealth. If there's no accumulation of wealth, then there's no investment. If there's no investment, then major undertakings would not be possible. If we don't value property, then basically the only thing that we could own is whatever we could guard in any particular given time, because somebody might always come and trying to steal it. If we don't value property, that's going to work against human flourishing. So there are many other ones. Pohman mentions the value of obedience to just laws, the value of comfort, the value of gratitude, the value of helping others, the value of respect for freedom. And to some degree, lesser or greater, those are all values that provide for human flourishing. But we can see, at least in the first four, that human civilization would be absolutely and utterly impossible unless a civilization or a society adopts those values. So what am I getting at here? Well, what I'm getting at basically is this: if there really is a core morality, then how can moral principles be relative? And to follow up, as it relates to the diversity thesis, moral principles may differ in a given society, or moral practices rather may differ, but moral principles or values are actually the same. Because every society has to recognize the value of truth-telling. Every society has to recognize the value of human life. Every society has to recognize the value of property and of promise-keeping. If they don't, then that society will collapse and will never get off the ground. Human flourishing would be impossible, and we would be human lives would be absolutely a terrible sort of frame of existence. So moral practices might differ in a culture, how they recognize those moral principles, but the underlying values are the same. Let me give you an example of that. Now, we mentioned earlier, we mentioned the example from Herodotus, the Greek historian, who talked about the Greeks burning their dead and the Galatians eating their dead. Well, why do the Greeks burn their dead? Those are definitely different moral practices. If you ever get invited to go to a Galatian funeral, don't go. Or eat before you go. I don't know, but but those are definitely different practices. There's the Greek funeral where cremation is practiced. There's the Galatian funeral rather, where cannibalism is practiced. And so why do they each do what they do? Well, the Greeks, if you ask them, why do you burn the dead and why do you put the silver coins? Well, you see, the Greeks believe in an afterlife. They believe that the soul is separate from the body and that the soul is sort of imprisoned in the body. And if you burn the flesh, the material body, then that allows the soul to release and move on to the next life in a more rapid fashion. It escapes the prison of the body and then moves on. Now, the silver coins are put on the eyes of the dead. because in Greek mythology, in order for the soul to migrate to the underworld, where it's going to spend the rest of eternity, it has to cross the river Styx. And the only way to get across the river Styx is to pay Charon, the ferryman. And so you pay him your coins, you get across the river, and then you can spend eternity in the world of the shades, or the underworld. And so that's the Greek worldview. Now notice why they did what they did. Well, the underlying value to their funeral practice was that they wanted to honor the one who had died, and they wanted to provide for that person's continued existence. They wanted to provide for the ongoing life of that individual, and so that's why they did what they did. Well, the Colossians, in a similar way, why did they do what they did? Well, the Colossians ate the dead because they had a different worldview. You see, they were more materialistic in their mindset, although they did have an idea of the soul. And they believed that if they consumed the flesh of the one that they wanted to honor, that person's spirit and that person's vitality would live on through them. And then when they died and they were consumed by their children and those that had come from them, they would continue on. So this again was a way of memorializing, of honoring, and of providing for the eternal or the continued existence of that person. Both of them had the same values, but they had different practices. And that's what goes on. That's what Pohman is discussing, or he's talking about, as it relates to core morality. Every culture has different. They may have different ways of showing it, but they all value the same thing. So the practices differ, but the values are the same. And what's more important when it comes to morals, the practice or the values, the underlying motivations and things that a culture considers important? So they're really not all that different. And here's another thing: if there is a core morality, how can those moral principles be relative? Because if there's a core morality that every culture has to adhere to, then that would seem to indicate that there is a universal moral set of moral principles. So this is an argument against the position of subjective or conventional ethical relativism and subjective ethical relativism. Now let's take a look at the dependency thesis. The dependency thesis says whether an act is right or wrong depends on the culture in which it takes place. Now the only way that this is true, now this is going to be kind of a complex point here, but the only way that the dependency thesis is true is if the conclusion of the argument is also true. In other words, the dependency thesis says whether an act is right or wrong depends on the culture in which it takes place. But the only way that this is actually true is if there are no such thing as universal moral principles. And so what is the argument that conventional relativism is trying to prove? Well, the argument they're trying to prove is there's no such thing as universal moral principles. So what you have here is a case where the second premise, or this dependency thesis, is simply just a rewording of the conclusion of the argument. Because if there are universal moral principles, then whether an act is right or wrong actually depends upon whether it conforms to those moral principles. It doesn't matter where it takes place. If killing is wrong, the killing of innocents is wrong, then it doesn't matter if it happened in Nazi Germany, because even though they said it was okay to kill Jewish people, because there is a universal moral principle that says killing of innocents is wrong. So the only way that the dependency thesis is true is if the conclusion is also true. By the way, in logic, this is what you call a circular argument. This is a circular argument basically is where you have the conclusion of the argument included in one of the premises above that conclusion. So this is what's known as a circular argument, and it's not a valid way of arguing. It is a circular form of argumentation. It's simply a restatement of the conclusion. When your conclusion is present in one of your premises, then you have a circular argument. So it's a fallacious way of arguing. Now, back to the original statement. Now, the argument that we provided, the diversity thesis, the dependency thesis, and the conclusion. Now, that argument has been shown to be fallacious. It can't be wrong, or it can't be right, rather. It has to. It doesn't. The premises do not lead to the conclusion. But here's the thing about logical arguing. Just because the premises in a particular argument do not lead to the conclusion in that argument does not necessarily mean the conclusion is wrong. It just means that this particular argument is not a valid or sound way of arguing for the point. So the idea of conventional relativism, the idea that morals come from individual cultures, there's a philosopher named James Rachels who asked a question about this. And the question that he asked is, what if we took this view seriously? What would happen if we took this seriously? In other words, what if we lived this out in our life? What if we lived this view out in our life? What would be some of the logical conclusions that we would have to accept? Some of the conclusions we'd have to accept. So, for example, let's consider the practice of sati. Now, the practice of sati was one in ancient Indian culture that whereby when a man died, he would, particularly if he was a man of some means, they would conduct a funeral for him, and the way they would do that is they would usually cremate the body. Now, they would sometimes put it on a funeral barge and set the barge on fire and sail him down the river. Sometimes they would just have a particular place in the village where they would burn the dead in a way of honoring them, and so they practiced cremation. But the practice of sati was a little bit different, because what they would do with the practice of sati is when the man died, they would also burn his widows with him, along with him. This is a problem, right? Because most of the time those widows were not yet dead, and yet they were burned alive alongside their husband. Is that okay? Is it okay that we kill a man's wife when he dies? Is that good? Well, let's consider it. If we take ethical or conventional relativism seriously, then here's some things. We'll use the practice of sati as an example. Here's some things that we necessarily would have to accept. Number one, the first thing we would have to accept is that we can no longer claim that our culture's moral principles are superior to anyone else's. We cannot claim that our culture's moral principles are superior to anyone else's. And so if we look at the practice of sati, for example, which is not the practice in the United States, we might be horrified at that. But wait a second, would we say it's wrong? If we would say it's wrong, then we are saying that our cultural way of burying the dead, or of dealing with the dead when they die, of funeral practices, that ours is superior to theirs. We don't have a basis for that, and why not? Well, because here's what happens. In cultural relativism, or conventional ethical relativism, we have our culture, which is sort of in its own bubble. We have the Indian culture. It's an ancient Indian culture, but we have the Indian culture over here. And they're separate from us. They're in its own few sort of hermetically sealed bubble. Whether sati is wrong or right in our culture is different than whether sati is wrong or right in their culture. Now, how could we possibly look over at their culture and say, theirs is wrong, theirs is bad, theirs is evil, they should not be doing that? The only way that we can do that is if there's a moral law that overarches both their culture and our culture, and to which we can look to that moral law that applies to them as well, and say, look, killing your wife when you die, or having your wife burned to death when you die is wrong, is morally wrong. But in conventional relativism, that moral law that overarches both of us does not exist. And so because that moral law does not exist, all that we're left with is what's right in our culture is right in our culture, and what's right in their culture is right in their culture. That's all we're left with. And so there's no way to look at them and say, well, they're being wrong, they're being evil, they're being bad. The only thing that we could say is we wouldn't do that. Or if they came over here and tried to do that, that would be wrong here. But in their culture, if it's what they accept, if it's an accepted practice, then it's accepted. So we can no longer claim that our culture's morals are superior to any other. Are we really willing to do that? Are we really willing to look, for example, at the abuses and the horrors of the Holocaust and say, well, it was no big deal. It was the German culture to do that, and that's what they would do. We wouldn't do it, but that's what they did. They killed 12 million people in concentration camps. We wouldn't do that. See, when we had our concentration camps, we kept them alive and provided for them and things like that. So we didn't do that terrible sort of thing. Are we really able then to say that our culture is better than theirs? Or, well, we have no basis for that if conventional relativism is true. Well, the second thing that Rachel's brings up, that if we take conventional relativism seriously, then we cannot say that we have progressed morally, that our culture has progressed morally. Now, why is that? Why can we not say that we have progressed morally? Well, because let's take the example of slavery or of interaction between the races. If we look back, can we say in the history of the United States that we have progressed in that way? Well, I think so. Now, there's a lot. That doesn't mean that things are perfect or things are even really that tolerable right now. But what it does mean is that there are things that about the way that it used to be that were much worse than what it is today. Now, that might be able to be debated, but here's the deal. Racism may be alive and well in the United States today. That may actually be the case. I think that's pretty undeniable. However, slavery as an institution is not being argued for in the halls of Congress. People are not arguing in favor of slavery in the halls of Congress. They are, if you bring up slavery, they are very much against that. It would be political suicide to be anything other than that. Or we could take, for example, the issue of women's rights. Have we progressed in that way? Again, we might be able to stand some more improvement along those lines, but certainly we have made progress. At least one would think. I mean, 200 years ago, for example, women did not have the right to vote. They couldn't own property. They didn't generally get a good education. There were all kinds of things that were just doors that were closed to women that today are quite simply just not a barrier. I mean, women make up more of the population in higher education today in colleges. There are many programs. Obviously, women can vote. Women can own property. They can get education. There are many things. Maybe there's more improvement that we need. That's debatable, certainly. But we have come a long way in the sense that things are much different now than they were then. But what are we saying? That if we take conventional relativism seriously, we can't say that we're better now than we were then. Now, why not? Well, because again, we have two totally sealed off cultures, say the United States in 1850, for example. In the United States today, we have these two separately sealed off cultures that do not communicate with one another, cannot communicate with one another. They don't have this overarching moral law that we can look to that culture and the practices that they practiced, then look to the moral law and say, well, according to the law that overarches both of us, that culture is wrong. We can't say that. We can't say that because there is no overarching moral law. There's nothing over us that we can compare it to. The only thing that we could say is that we're different now than we were then, and we would do things differently now than we would then. That's it. That's all we can say. There's nothing more that we can say, and there's no overarching moral law in conventional relativism. So we cannot say that we've progressed. And incidentally, we can't say that we've gotten worse either, because again, that's them, that was then, this is now. There's no moral law overarching the both of us. Therefore, we have to live consistently. If we're going to be consistent with conventional relativism, we have to live with the understanding that we can't talk about moral progress in the past. The third and probably the most damaging of these critiques that James Rachels offers is that if we take conventional relativism seriously, then initiating moral progress in itself is immoral. Initiating moral progress in itself is immoral. Now, why is that? Well, because again, we have if we're looking forward, if we're looking at our society right now and we're saying that we need to do better, we need to improve, we need to do some things differently. Basically what we're saying is that there's something wrong with our culture that needs to be fixed. And so we look into the future and we imagine a future if those things that were wrong were actually fixed and they were taken care of. We look into the future and imagine an ideal society that is different than our society, right? So that's going to be the culture now and the ideal culture. And so if we do that, basically what we're doing is, again, we have two different societies. We have our society, we have an ideal society. And what we're saying is that our society is worse than the ideal society, and so we need to change. We need to initiate moral progress in order to change. But here's the deal. In order to say that that society is better than our society, there has to be an overarching moral law so that we can look at that moral law that overarches both of our societies, and we can say, hey, look, we don't measure up. We need to do better in this situation. And so the moral law tells us that we need to do better, so let's apply ourselves and accomplish some moral progress. We can't do that because there's no moral law above our society. The only thing that we can look to tell whether something is good or bad or right or wrong is our society, is our culture, and the moral principles that are present and active in that culture. So actually what happens if we are initiating moral progress is we're breaking the moral law in our culture right here, right now. That would be immoral since we have nothing higher to which we can appeal. Now, if you're going to live consistent with conventional relativism, this is where you land. You can't have moral progress. You cannot, for example, be Martin Luther King Jr. saying, "I have a dream," because what is that? Dr. King was looking forward to a society where there would be equality, where there would be integration of the races and respect among the races, and that would impose a tremendous an ordeal in society, where little black boys and little black girls and little white boys and little white girls could play together and not see this distinction between them as being something so significant that they can't love one another. That's the kind of society that Dr. King imagined, but was not the kind of society that he was living in. And for him, if cultural relativism is serious, if it's something to be taken seriously, if that's actually the way things are, then he could not have said, "I have a dream," and that dream could not have been a good dream. It would have been immoral to initiate progress. But instead, what did he do? Well, if you've read Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. King appeals to just laws and unjust laws in society. Well, how can you tell if a law is just or unjust if there's no overarching moral principle to say whether it's just or unjust? And he appeals to that. He calls an unjust law a law that does not square with the law of nature or the law of God. And so he's appealing to the law of nature and the law of God, two sources of moral authority that are outside of that culture that would condemn the culture for the racist acts that were taking place in the culture. So if we're going to take cultural relativism seriously or conventional relativism seriously, we cannot initiate moral progress. We cannot say there's something wrong and I want to change it. That itself would be immoral. Okay, so those are three scathing critiques that Rachel's offers. He does more, but I think those three are good for us to look at now. And the question we need to ask ourselves is this: there are three. Are we willing to live without critiquing other cultures? Are we willing to live without critiquing other cultures? If we're not, then we're not a conventional relativist. The second question is, are we willing to live without recognizing moral progress or moral regress in our own culture? Because if we're not willing to do that, then we're not a conventional relativist. And the third is this: are we willing to forsake the idea that moral progress is possible? Are we willing to say that the culture that we live in now is perfect? Because if we're not willing to do that, then we're not a conventional relativist. And I know the temptation in our society, and I think conventional relativism probably is the view in our society that is most prevalent. And yet it is not one that we actually live consistently. I think everybody here, everybody in this class, maybe for different reasons and maybe on different issues, every single one of us would say, yeah, if I could do something about the world in which I live, the society in which I live, my neighborhood, my city, my town, I would change something. Now, if that's you, then you're not a conventional relativist. You believe in a higher standard of good. And the question remains is, what is that higher standard of good and where does it come from? Well, we'll be talking about that in class when we get together. We'll be doing some things related to that as well. I look forward to seeing you there, and we'll talk then. Goodbye.